thing with a lot of business owners. You're right. They may not understand the value of their business. And a lot of that is because most business owners have built their business from the ground up. And it's their baby.
Yeah, American dream.
American dream. And they typically believe that their business is worth more than it is. Now, that's not always the case, but that is typically the case.
We call that the sweat equity side of it, right? So you put so much sweat equity inside of your business, it's kind of like a kid of yours, right? You grew it up from an infant, and had work your tail off on it, 10, 20-hour days sometimes. And then it becomes this good business, and now you're not going to sell it for anything than what you think in your head's at fair market value. Right. But how do you define a fair market value for a business?
So look, you can value a business in multiple ways. The most common way for an M&A transaction, a private equity deal, is going to be a market multiple, and that's based off the EBITDA term that you mentioned. So earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So that's essentially, just real simplistic. Net income, adding back depreciation and amortization because they are non-cash expenses, and adding back interest and tax expense because that's something that can be manipulated by management depending on how you choose to operate the business.
Okay, let's stop right there because that's a lot of technical terms. I don't think anybody or everybody understands those, right? So we have earnings. So you're just talking about gross earnings. So how do you get to gross earnings? And that sales minus COGS, and that gives you gross earnings?
Yeah, so that net income number, right? You have sales.
Okay.
You subtract out all of the expenses, which include COGS, include just kind of general.
COGS are cost of goods sold. So it's like your hard cost. Like if you're selling this bottle of water, right? So you got to buy the plastic for it, right? So that would be a cost of goods sold. So that's like a component inside of it.
Yep. And then the SG&A, selling, general, and administrative expenses, are everything below COGS.
Okay.
Okay, and that might be administrative, might be rent, utility, things like
hard
that.
Cost to run a business.
Yeah, marketing expenses usually down there.
Okay.
So you take out all of the expenses of the business.
Okay.
From that gross revenue that you have, and that's how you get to the net income.
And so that's earnings.
Or you can call it earnings, if
right?
You want, sure.
So earnings before taxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Interest.
Yep.
Depreciation's a big one, right? Amortization, hardly anybody understands, right? Which one am I missing here?
That's it.
Okay, right? So let's just go interest, right? So if I run a business and you run a business and we run the same exact business, I might be able to treat my business because I want more leverage, which we'll explain later. So I'm going to need interest that I have to pay because I'm going to take leverage as debt. So I'm going to take on $2 million worth of debt because I want to grow the business faster instead of putting my own money in it,
sure.
Right? But you could run that same business and say, oh, I don't want to take on debt. So to get on a common ground, how everybody evaluates the business the same, I don't think it's the greatest model to do it that way, but that's just here or there.
It's the most common way.
Common way, right? Is you take and add back in the interest as if there was no debt there. That way your business and my business would be evaluated the same, right?
Sure.
Same thing with depreciation. So I could choose to go buy 10 vehicles because I don't want to pay any taxes and I wanted to use the 179 depreciation or accelerated depreciation inside of my business to mitigate my tax liability, but I also wanted to buy 10 vehicles to expand in multiple markets. And you're like, no, I'm older. I don't want to do anything. I don't want that growth. So we have to add back in the depreciation or the write-offs that you got for the benefit of equipment or whatever you want.
And
buildings, depreciation is just anything.
Right. And one of the big things with depreciation and amortization is it's because they're non-cash expenses. So they are expenses that are lowering your income,
right?
Your net income, your taxable income. But there's no cash going out the door for those on an annual basis. You may have $200,000 of depreciation, but you didn't spend $200,000 on that. You didn't.
It's what the asset is lost in value over time that you bought it and you want to push it forward and accelerate that depreciation or whatever it may be, right? But you're adding all that back in so you actually get a higher net income amount
a lower. Well, when you add it back you're
in.
getting EBITDA is higher than
right.
net income. Yeah.
So again, you're trying to add back all of these things to get on common ground of if you had no depreciation, no interest, no amortization, right, and no debt, everything inside of there is added back into it. So if you just look on what the value of that company is, that gives you that value, right?
That is right. Yes.
So then how do you evaluate what it's going to be sold or bought for? How do you do multiples?
Yeah, so it depends on the industry.
Okay.
And it depends on even the size of the company within an industry impacts it. There could be specific characteristics about one company versus another that makes it worth more.
So you're talking about like whether it's a strategic buyer compared to a competitor buyer, or are you talking about just because this industry sells at a higher multiple because it's a more revenue generating industry compared free cash flow industry compared to a different one?
It really depends.
What do you mean?
So let's just talk about one specific industry. We'll go back to the air conditioning for a second. So air conditioning. Yeah, the multiples in that industry, depending on the size of the company and the characteristics of the company, could range from 2 or 3 times EBITDA to 15 or 16 times EBITDA.
Yeah, like publicly traded companies actually sell for on average like 15 to 16 times. You don't really see that in small business though. Maybe if it's something special or it's strategic, right? It's usually what's the norm that you people always kind of need to say, mark your book at this and as a good.
It varies even within the smaller businesses. It can vary quite a bit by the size of the amount of EBITDA the business is generating. So if a business is generating $200,000 of EBITDA, that's going to probably command a much different multiple than a business that's generating $5 million of EBITDA.
So somebody's willing to pay a little higher price because there's so much more value in that higher EBITDA number.
And the reason there's typically more value is there's less risk. So if you have $200,000 of net income or $5 million of net income, right, you got a lot more margin for error if you have $5 million of the bottom line. You could lose, you could do something that, maybe 1 year something happens, right? It could be just the macro economy, the greater economy, causes issues just across the board, and maybe you lose 50% of your business that year for some reason. Well, you still generate $2.5 million of EBITDA. But the other business
only
generated 100,000.
Right.
And what happens if both of those businesses had debt on them? Because remember, we're adding back the interest expense.
Sure.
Maybe that $200,000 EBITDA business had $120,000 of interest expense.
Yeah, so that gets into your burn rate, right? So that gets into, if you had all your debt service payments inside of your business and you take all that back out, you have to have a certain amount of margins and if you have less revenue at the end of the day, those margins could be a lot tighter or there's a lot less room for error pretty much, right? Before you start going, I can't make my, salary to my employees because I got to pay my debt inside of there because we're down 20 or 30% this quarter.
Right.
I always thought the golden rule for small businesses, and they ask me every time I sit down with the business owner, hey, what do you think my business is worth? And I always have to do the diplomatic, hey guys, I can't give you a valuation on your business, but I will tell you that most businesses in Texas, depending on the industry you're in, can sell for anywhere from 3 to 5 times EBITDA, right? Or they could get as high as 7 to 10 to 15 to 20, but we don't really know until you actually go through a valuation with somebody like you, right? So that 3 to 5 number multiple is kind of always thought that was like, hey, small businesses, you could get 3 to 5 on there. Now, you might get a strategic buyer. You're going to get a higher multiple. If you don't have good EBITDA, like you're saying, it's a little more risk. You might only get a 3 times EBITDA. I mean, there's one here in West Texas that it's a part of a family that I know that's, looking at selling at like, we'll be lucky to get a 3 times EBITDA, right? And it's just a really small business. And so there's not a whole lot of growth that you can have in smaller businesses.